Welcome to the API user experience. My name is Michael Irigoyen, and I'm going to be talking about a topic where many of you may find unusual to be at an API conference, user experience. How many are familiar with the phrase user experience? Okay. Now, how many here are front-end developers or would consider themselves to be a front-end developer? Far fewer. Right. Well, user experience speaks to a lot of how a user interacts with something, right? And there's a lot of really good and bad examples of user experience just every day in the world, right? So if we take a look at something like this, that's bad user experience. I would like to venture a guess of what came first, the chicken or the egg, the traffic light or the bridge here, but something doesn't seem quite right here. This is what happens when you don't have proper design and planning around some kind of way that people are going to interact with something. Here's another example. But you also have to think about all of your users, because not all users have the same skill set. So while you may give them a good user experience, they may use your product or your API in really interesting ways that you don't expect, and you need to be able to handle those types of situations. Sometimes users are just stupid. And all of these things, as an engineer, as a developer, even with the correct blueprints, you're always going to end up like this guy at some point, just by observing how people use your API. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Michael Irigoyen. I've been doing UI and UX for over 15 years. I started in PHP, moved on to Node and JavaScript. Right now I'm doing a full spectrum of things, both at the back end and the front end, React, Node.js microservices. And I work for Accusoft, and we're all about solving document lifecycle complexities with APIs and SDKs for a whole bunch of different things. I'll kind of go into those towards the end of the presentation and kind of circle things around here. But the biggest thing is we create a lot of RESTful APIs and SDKs, and that's our main business. So let's start off first, and I want to talk kind of about what is an API. There's lots of different definitions out there. There's lots of different ways you can describe what an API is, but this is one that I kind of like. An application programming interface is a software intermediary that allows two applications, or more than two applications, to talk to one another. The one thing I don't like about this is it's missing one key piece, and what do you think that is? It's actually a piece that a developer, usually a human being, is programming two interfaces to talk to each other. So what we need to do is ask ourselves, in a lot of cases, why aren't people using our APIs? And more to the point is, some of these applications that you may be developing, maybe the API is the product, so why aren't people using our product? These are questions that you may get. And we have to try to figure those questions out. So let's go and consult our friend Alan here, who seems very perplexed about the complexities in API consumption. So what we're looking at in API complexities are non-standard interfaces. Those types of things are going to make it more difficult for users to start picking up and using your API. Poor or lack of versioning. This has gotten better, but there's still some different kinds of methodologies and tactics and how do we version, so we'll go into that a little bit. Return data models are inconsistent, so when it comes to API design and providing a good user experience, you always want to be as consistent as you can across the entirety of your API, just so that you can keep people engaged with it. Redundant requests for simple tasks. How many people have used an API where you have to make one request that gives you a whole bunch of data back, and then you have to make like 50 individual requests just to get more information about the 50 things that was returned to you in that first one? So we want to take those kind of things and find a way to simplify them to the users that are consuming the API. And then the next piece, let's see. Oh, well, I guess the next piece would be bad documentation, because I just know what the heck happened there. So we're going to go ahead and add bad documentation to that list, because documentation is going to be the name of the game here. When we take a look at the user experience spectrum of UI design, it's always centered around the user. The user can't figure it out, then what's the point? You're always going to be designing for people, even in the API spectrum. So let's talk about what user experience is. It's actually a defined standard by the International Standards Organization. It's a person's perceived perception or responses to the anticipated use of a product or system or service, which an API falls underneath. So what that says is UX does not apply only to user interfaces. What UX tries to do is enhance the customer experience. And that includes improving usability and creating just a way to interact with your API more easily. It also promotes satisfaction. You want someone to feel good when they're done using what you've created. That's probably going to turn into them telling their developer friends about your API, and you're going to grow organically. So what you want to do is you want to design your API for humans. Okay? You want to throw away the notion that you are going to be building your API for another computer to use or another system to use. While that is inherently true, somebody has to do that work to figure that out and to get that all working. So humans are the ones integrating your API. So you need to determine what your users need to be successful integrating your API, and that's going to make, in turn, your API be more successful. And what I'd like to show here, this is the user experience honeycomb. It was developed by Peter Morville. It's 7 categories of the different areas that you want to hit while creating user interfaces or user experience for whatever. There's real similar competing kind of methodologies that are really similar. There's, I believe, the user experience wheel by Magnus Ravang. So there's a couple different ways. They all pretty much fall back to, though, these kind of 7 categories. So we've got usability, usefulness, desirability, how valuable it is, findable, credible, accessible. And what I want to do is I want to take something here, and we're going to take a user story here, and as a consumer of your API, I want it to provide functionality I need. Well, yes, of course. Why else would they be using your API? We want it to provide something useful to the user. We want it to be well documented and easy to use. We want it to have an easy path to get support. Should be organized, should be manageable, should probably be secure in this day and age. Be consistent in what we're doing here. So let's go ahead and take this back to the user experience honeycomb and take a look. Okay, so the first thing is provides functionality I need. We're going to light up a couple of these here. That makes this useful, makes it valuable, makes it desirable. I don't think anybody can argue with that. It's well documented and easy to use. Well, if you're well documented, that's desirable to me because I can figure it out. It's going to be usable. I'll be able to find the things that I need in your documentation to allow me to implement it. And it's going to be accessible because you're actually giving me the information that I need and what I should do with it. Easy path to get support. Well, we're just going to light up credible there too. When you have an API documentation out there and you have no way for somebody to give you feedback on it, you lose a little bit of credibility because you're not backing up what you have out there. So give your users that are going to be implementing your API a way to at least leave feedback or get in contact with you if they're having more problems. You can probably improve your documentation that way, find bugs in the system, and just make yourself more available to your users. Output is organized and manageable, so we're going to light up valuable there. Interface is secure, so again, we're going to add some more on the credible. And it's consistent. So as we go through all these, we lit every part of the user experience honeycomb up. These are a lot of the things that we do kind of when we do brainstorming through coming up with new UX for like a user interface and how people are going to interact with things. They very simply apply to API design, which I think is fantastic. So we're going to go back and take a look here at our 5 complexities that I outlined earlier, and I would like to just kind of go through each one of them in a little bit and what we can do to make them less complex and make the user experience a little bit better. Now, out of all of these, there's been, I could put a talk around each of these bullet points, and I'm sure there's been many here today of people who've gone into much detail about best practices for different aspects of APIs. So I'm going to go through these a little quick, but I figured this would be a good way to handle this part of the presentation. So we're going to talk about the non-standard interfaces. Most people here are probably going to be implementing some sort of RESTful interface. If you are following, a standard like REST, take care to understand and implement your API according to the standard. How many times have you used the REST interface where everything is just a post, like even to get information or to update something? Have you ever run into an API that has done that? Okay, that's good because that used to be the trend back, even 5 years ago. So people are getting better and better about following the standard. It's what people are going to expect when you say you have a RESTful API when they go from your API to another API. Now, if you're creating your own interface and you're using, you're creating an API in your software, you want to take the extra time to design and forward think your interface. You want to create patterns. You want to be, not too specific, but you also don't want to overly genericize your API endpoint or your API endpoints or your API interfaces that you're going to be exposing. Something that's going to keep you future-proof is to consider object-based parameters. That allows you to extend in the future. That way you don't have to worry about versioning to an extent. You can easily build on that without much trouble and not have to change your interfaces. But the most important thing, if you take anything from this, is just keep everything consistent. You may do something a little bit differently than a competitor or a different company or a different product, but as long as all your things remain consistent, it becomes very easy for your user to continually use your endpoints and move on with that. Poor lack of versioning. This has some debate around it if you do some searching for the proper ways to version your endpoint, especially around the RESTful stuff. But it is important that you still always have a strategy for versioning your API. Even if you plan, you never intend to break it. Whoever intends to break their API moving forward, right? You can't predict the future. So you want to make sure that you're versioning things, and you want to plan a versioning scheme on how you want to do that. So there's different ways to handle that. Some people put the version in the URL, some put it in header, some put it actually in the request. And there's pros and cons to all those. It all really depends on your application's needs, but be consistent about it. If you choose one way, use it for all of your API endpoints in the confines of your product. Don't be switching it up, because now you're just confusing your users. Your return data models. I'm going to make a declaration here to kind of stick to JSON and XML. That depends on your product completely, but these are the two most standard data models that people are expecting to get back. JSON being very, very easy to work with in a lot of programming languages these days. So because they're common and because they're easy to use, you have more of a draw for your developers, because they don't have to manipulate your data or do something special with it. So if you stick with something that's going to be very popular, it's less work that you have to do and more exposure that your API is going to get. As a recommendation of mine, though, I'd like to say don't intermix them if you can. Don't have some endpoints that return XML, some endpoints that return JSON, some endpoints that return something else. Try to be as consistent as you can. You'll notice that as a theme that I'm hammering on here is consistency. That's what users are going to expect. Users are lazy. They want the easiest way to get from point A to point B. So the more consistent you can be, the better. And play to the lowest common denominator. If you need to be more specific, something that's more typed, like XML, is going to be better for you. JSON's going to be more lightweight. Those are just the two, more common ones. All right, so redundant requests for simple tasks. I kind of alluded to this a little earlier, but you want to design your interfaces so that a task can be done as in fewest requests as possible. Now that sounds great and sounds easy, but you don't want to break your separations of concerns either. If you follow the REST standard, you're dealing with a specific resource, and that's all you should be dealing with. You don't want that to carry over. So to handle that, maybe you want to support bulk requests. So I get a bunch of responses back for resources, and I need to get more information on those. So I'm going to now post to get a bulk information of that. Sometimes you do have to break REST rules, but you want to do things that are going to be the easiest for your customers and consistent. The other thing that you can do is consider creating an SDK for your REST interfaces, especially ones that can be more complex, because you can hide a lot of the complexities of those APIs behind an SDK, where it now just becomes a function call and a promise returns me later with my result, and I don't have to worry about a pull to the server to wait for a document to be finished processing, or if you deal with server affinity or any of those types of things where it doesn't make sense for the user to figure those things out and have to care about those. You can handle those in an SDK, then that may be a good choice for you. Especially with the kind of rise of NPM and some of these other package managers, where it becomes very easy to just NPM install my package, and now I have an interface to start working with the API. So going back then one more time and looking at our complexities, Alan still looks a little perplexed, and that's because I really want to call out bad documentation here. That's where I want to spend the remainder of the time of this presentation, because I think it is one of the weakest points in the API world right now. And I'm going to make a sweeping declaration here, and feel free to disagree with me, but documentation is the most important part of your API. With API documentation, it doesn't matter how clean your code is, it doesn't matter how it's implemented. Without proper documentation, you are deterring people from using it. And we all know that no APIs are the same. They may have similar protocols or similar patterns, but you're never going to light up the honeycomb without documentation. There's literally no way to do it. You're providing nothing. So you're actually going to make our little bee friend here in his honeycomb pretty sad. So what you need to do is think about documentation early and often. You know, when you're creating a new API, try to include a documentation plan as early as possible as part of your API design. Consider it as just another component of your API. And you want to answer yourself these questions. What needs to be documented? Who's going to write the documentation? Is it going to be your developers, your engineers? Do you have a tech writer? Do you have a project manager? Who is your target audience? So are you going to be catering to more novice or entry-level engineers, or are you really going to be targeting, senior level or people who are like just in the nitty-gritty of code every day? Identifying that really helps how you document. Where will it be stored? Are you going to use something like JSDoc, where it's you're documenting API endpoints right in your code and they get checked into Git, and now your documentation sits next to your code? Is it in a wiki? Is it you need to figure that out and try to keep more of a single source of where all your documentation comes from, so that when somebody comes and needs to find more information, they know where to look. And lastly, how will it be generated for users? So if you're doing something like JSDoc, obviously you have to do some kind of conversion, because they're probably not looking through your source code to figure out how to use your API. Of course, not everybody's creating a brand new documentation or a brand new API from scratch, so start looking for places, weak points in your current APIs where you can start to improve documentation. I'll kind of talk a little bit how to get into that in a slide further on. But documentation isn't just for your users, because we're focusing right now on user experiences, but we also want to think about the developers. The developers are actually working on the code that you're trying to document. So what I recommend is document your private interfaces too. This is going to give you practice into actual documentation for your public interfaces. You're getting in the habit, you're following this kind of process or this procedure. It definitely helps with onboarding any kind of new employees or new people that come onto the team, because now they can actually go and see what something's doing without having to dig into it right away. And now your work's already there. So if you have a private endpoint that now you need to make public, you don't have to go back through it and write documentation to expose that. You can change the flag or do whatever you need to do to expose that endpoint as a public endpoint. You want to provide an intuitive documentation site. So this is a little bit more now where the real UX of UI comes into it. Being more back-end source developers, we're going to want to look at something that kind of helps us with that, because we don't want to make a website just for our API. We want to have some help with that. So find an open source library that does some of the heavy lifting if you don't want to create that yourself. There's tons of them out there. You definitely want to create a getting started section, so that when somebody comes and lands on your documentation for the first time, they're kind of introduced to what your API is going to do, what's the easiest path to get from point A to point B, and kind of talk about some of the higher level or the fundamentals of your API at a very high level, just so they can kind of get familiarized with what they're going to be looking at. If you look at something like Twitter's documentation, and they're getting started stuff, they talk about what a tweet is and what a status is. They kind of introduce you to some of their terminology. So those are good things to put in your getting started section. So as I continue to read their documentations, when they refer to a tweet, now I know what it is. So kind of just keep things at a high level there. You don't want to get too in the weeds. You don't want to also forget about search. Now there's two ways to handle this. You can use some kind of provider that adds search to your static site, or a lot of places are going now with a single like a single page application, which just has everything on one, a single site application. That allows you to use the find command right in your browser. So, Command F on Mac, and just start typing in, and you're going to jump to the place on the page. Search is important because when you get somebody who comes in who's already using your API, they're probably looking for one specific thing. They want to jump right to it. So, let's make it easy for them to find that and move on. And then, as I talked a little earlier about, you want to provide easy ways for someone to give you feedback. Put a feedback link on the piece of documentation or on the site as a whole. Try not to take somebody away from what they're looking at, especially with like single page applications. It's really good maybe to pop up a modal or kind of take over the area that they're working in and give them a way to, in the fewest form fields as possible, give you feedback. If they have to fill out a million things or authenticate, those are things that are going to prevent feedback from coming through, but you have to work on that as at a product level and what you expect to get from your users in terms of feedback. But feedback is extremely important. And when we're talking about some more of these open source tools that are available, there's several out there. I just kind of outlined a couple. especially a couple that we've looked at internally at Accusoft, but there's a whole bunch of them out there, and they all have good starting points and are open source and are pretty good at changing if you need to make specific changes for your product, but they do really good at pulling information out and displaying it in a pretty way and not having to worry about all the under the hood stuff for that. You also want to break the first barrier, which is authentication. So pretty much every API has an authentication part, and if you can't do anything with your authentication, you can't get through, you can't use the rest of your API. It's likely to be the most complex part of your API. That's probably not always the case depending on the kind of API that you are providing, but without authentication, I literally can't do anything more with your API, so now I'm going to go somewhere else. So you want to make sure that you break it out into its own section. Even if you have all of your other API endpoints kind of like grouped together, authentication is its own thing, and you want to be very thorough about what your authentication methods are, what you support, provide detailed code examples, make sure that it is super easy to get through the authentication part, and you're golden. Talking about code examples, code samples are king, and they're becoming more and more popular, especially interactive code samples, ones that I can run right in the documentation. It doesn't even have to actually hit the API endpoint, but it needs to return, okay, I'm going to give it this payload and I get this response back. Now I understand how this is going to work. I can go implement this without ever having to open up their, fire up VS Code or whatever and start doing anything. They can see how this is going to work and say, okay, yeah, we can make this work. That's going to be big on keeping people within your API and wanting to use it. Consider using tools like Postman to offer collections of your API for download. They have a API interface or API like kind of collection database where you can register your public API and someone can just pull it down through their Postman application. You can offer it as a download. Some people are even starting to use Postman to generate documentation, which is awesome. It's definitely putting less work. You're going to just save yourself an extra step there. So that's something to check out because they can probably handle it for you as well. And then copy-paste blocks. If I can take and copy-paste something, maybe you don't want to do the interactive examples. You don't have the capability of doing those right now. Something they can just copy and paste right into their code and it works. That's sometimes a little bit more difficult to do because you don't know what they're copy and pasting to do, but if you can provide something that just gets them off the ground. We're trying to get them off the ground as fast as possible so that become engaged with what they're doing instead of just trying to figure out. The sooner they can get over the question of will this work and oh yeah, I can see how this is going to work, the more likely they are to continue to work with your API. And then the other part is tracking analytics. You want to track them on the documentation that we're creating, and you also want to do it on your APIs. They can help you focus on problem points, sticking points, popularity, especially if you can look for patterns based on, oh, people are going to this specific endpoint in my documentation, and wow, we're getting a lot of error codes out of that specific endpoint. Maybe there's something going on there, and now people are coming in to look at what's going on. Are they handling the error wrong? You can kind of start to see where things are, kind of falling apart and kind of make these correlations of the different data. So collecting that data is going to be really important. The other thing that we started to do at Accusoft, which has turned out to be very, very useful, so if you've ever gone to, I think, Slate or Stripe, they have the code samples on the right-hand side, and they got a bunch of different tabs, and they got Node and Ruby and Java. We didn't know which ones we should be targeting. And so the first response was, okay, well, we'll just put up a Node sample, and we'll put up a Java sample and a C++ sample, because that's what we primarily deal with at Accusoft, and we'll be done with it. We got the idea, okay, we're going to actually add tabs for Ruby, and we're going to add tabs for a couple of the other programming languages that are, kind of more popular with what we're doing. And we're just going to put something like, code sample coming soon. But we're tracking analytics on that click. So now, at the 3-week, 4-week mark, we go back and look at that. We haven't really gotten any feedback about somebody saying, hey, I'd like to see a Go code sample. But hey, 12% of our user base who has come in has clicked on Go, and we don't have a code sample for it, so maybe we should write one. So let data drive how you document, especially in terms of code samples, because you can have an engineer that specifically writes code samples, and that's all they do, and that's their whole job. It can be, easier to get through those things when you have the data to tell you what to do. So checking back in here with Alan, I think he gets it. Cool. So what I want to do is kind of go into the real world and take a look at some of the applications of this with APIs at Accusoft. Now, so Accusoft provides APIs for barcode recognition, OCR, and we expose SDKs because some of those things can be pretty complex. And we also have a Prism Doc family, which we do RESTful interfaces for more document viewing and editing conversion. So the biggest area that we've outlined that we need to improve on is our documentation. We're on version 13.4 of Prism Doc, so it's been around for a while. The company's been around for 25 plus years. So we have a lot of legacy documentation that we just need to keep up to date. So we're working to firstly improve on the consistency of our documentation, our existing documentation, but also we have a new product that we're starting to get ready to release called Prism Doc Editor, which is going to be like edit docx files in your browser, kind of like Google Docs, but API driven, so you can really integrate it into your product and have hooks on it, which is really, really neat. But because of this, we're starting with a brand new documentation strategy. And we've tried a few different things, and we got a couple things that are going to stick, and as we get ready to do our first release here on October 1st, we actually have a pretty good documentation suite going forward. And then we're actually looking at some of the other places, especially around our RESTful APIs, where we can start to implement more SDKs, especially stuff that's going to go right in the web. We want to tap into NPM and those types of things, so it becomes really easy for a developer to just install at the command line and start messing with something and not have to worry about the complexities behind things. So just to kind of go in summary of what I've talked about today, and if you take anything away from this presentation, it would be to try to do everything you can to reduce and remove barriers that cause your customers from easily getting started with your API. You want to build a documentation strategy for your product or company and try to stick to it. A lot of your products are probably pretty well established, so that may be more difficult, but slow, gradual. Determine where your weaknesses are, figure out how you're going to attack those, come up with some kind of standard for how you're going to implement that documentation strategy, and then stick with it. And anything new that comes up, just try to stick with it. Be consistent. Be data-driven. Analytics are huge. Anybody that's in web knows that, and you can put these analytics on your documentation, on your API endpoints. It's going to tell you a lot of information about how people are using your API and how people are getting information from your documentation, and it's going to help lead those types of decisions in the future. And just lastly, just always be thinking about the customer experience. You want your customer's experience to be nice, smooth, not have to worry about any sticking points. They're going to happen, but the sooner that you can do that, the sooner it's going to be easier for your customers to get working with your API, and you're going to raise your satisfaction level up. So I'm getting the 5-minute mark. I do have a spot here for Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and skip this. If you have any questions at all, just come see me right here after the conference or after the presentation, and I'd be more than happy to kind of talk with you or answer any questions you have. So thank you for coming in and listening to me speak. I hope it was beneficial for you guys.